I'll be talking about later, of course, because of the rise of Prussia. So anyway, I want to welcome you back, of course, to History 1123. Of course, we're still talking about the age of absolutism, which we probably will today and also next Tuesday, which is I think that's the September 22nd, looks like it. So anyway, just, of course, a few things kind of talk about today. So yeah, this is pretty much the topics we'll, talk about today, which, I'll wrap up talking about the Austrian Habsburgs and their empire, which was part of the Holy Roman Empire as well. And then we'll discuss the rise of Prussia. So I hope y'all are doing well this morning. Y'all keeping safe out there, huh? No hurricanes hitting us, luckily, I guess, over here. Looks like there's a storm in the Gulf. I'm kind of wondering about what that's about. So hopefully we don't get that next week. But anyway, if anybody wants to join me in the broadcast booth right now, you can at StreamYard.com. There's the link to it if you want to come in right now and join me. Or, of course, you can, like I said, watch it later, of course, because I'm streaming this lecture today, of course, as a whole. Did want to remind you about some upcoming assignments that we've got coming up right now. Of course, I've got this, of course, announcement right here. Of course, those two assignments, they're still open. I believe they close tonight, those two, which, of course, is the one on the Hernan Cortez canvas quiz, that little documentary I had you watch, of course. So that one's due tonight. And then also the one on exploration, Age of Discovery, is also due as well tonight. I extended it 2 days. It was due Tuesday, but I usually give you a little more time on it. So I'm sure we got some stragglers here that haven't finished it yet, but try to get that done tonight if you can. Because next week, I think probably Tuesday likely, I am going to have your first online exam, first exam coming up, which pretty much I've finished it. Finished your exam this week. I think it's looking like 40-something questions. I might have added a few more to it because I was kind of needed some more room there. 40, 45, I think is how many questions I'm going to have on the first exam online. And it's going to be like, you will have 2 attempts on it for that assignment, and it will be timed. So I'll have an announcement later about it, probably on Tuesday next week. But I don't think we're going to finish absolutism. I think we've got to finish the stuff on the Austrians and got to talk about Prussia. And I don't know if I'll get to Russia today. We'll see, but likely Russia will probably be on Tuesday next week. Okay. I have put up a new assignment. I guess I'll keep that up there for now. But I do have a new assignment I've got. I need to show you that I did post, which is let me see if I can find it real quick here. But it's on the key terms assignment. There's a new one, of course, coming up that I posted, which will be due in October. The one now, the first key terms, that one is due next Tuesday, which is I think I moved that one up to September 22nd. So, if you already have it finished, you can upload it to the speed grader, the first one. But that one is due by September, looks like 22nd. Okay. So try to get that done. But that new one is not due till October. So if you finish the first one, you can already start working on the second one, assignment right here. Now I'll open it up for you real quick. But some of these terms we've already kind of gone over already, but you've got some other ones that are fairly new, like about England. We haven't really done much on that yet, like English history, and we'll get to that later. Scientific Revolution, Enlightenment, those are some other terms, but some of the terms we'll be getting to this week and next week, like on absolutism. Okay, so that's pretty much some of the assignments I've got coming up right now that I've got. Of course, today I'm going to, like I said, I'm going to move on. I'm going to talk about, talking about the rise of absolutism. Hey, good morning. What's going on? You Lee, what's up? Anybody else wants to come into StreamYard, of course, I just put the link up, of course, right here if you want to come in. So let me go ahead and, of course, we're going to, of course, talk about, we haven't really finished talking about what happened with Austria because, their empire continues onward into down into the 19th century and into, of course, all the way down to World War I as well, because a lot of that we won't get to later. Talk about the later part of the Austrian Empire and all that. I think the last class we had talked about Maria Theresa. She had come to power in 1740. She took over, and she was, remember, she came into power because of the Pragmatic Sanction, 1713, which was issued by Emperor Charles VI because he didn't have any male heirs. So she ended up getting the throne here. She married Francis of Lorraine, who became known as Francis I, the Holy Roman Emperor. He was Holy Roman Emperor from I think 1745 to 1780. Actually 1745 to 17, I think it's 65, I think as it is actually. And anyway, they had a bunch of children. And of course, I told you the children became known as the Habsburg Lorraine dynasty, is what they dubbed it. And I'll get into the children's and all of that came at all of her kids, not all the kids, but I'll get into the main children that she had that were famous. Now, I told you how Maria Theresa was famous for kind of modernizing her state. She was an enlightened despot, but she was still an absolute monarch. Her husband, Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor, was just he was just a figurehead. She was one that had the real power because she had controls of a lot of the land throughout part of the empire in Austria. And so she was the one that had all the real power. But at first she had trouble. If you know about Maria Theresa, she had this nemesis who we'll talk about a lot later, who's Frederick the Great, Frederick II of Prussia here. Those two became staunch enemies starting in 1740. I'll show you a little video clip. Frederick the Great decided to invade part of her empire, and he seized Silesia, which we'll talk more about later, why Silesia was big. And so they came to power at the same time, both those rulers, Frederick in 1740 and Maria Theresa in 1740. And before that, Austria and Prussia had been allies. They had been, close friends. And then after that, they became enemies. And you'll see later what happens with Austria. Austria later switches and becomes allied with, of course, the French. And then Prussia later it gets allied with the British. So you get this kind of change of diplomatic alliances in Europe at the time. But it did spark a war for a while, the 1740s, which was called the War of the Austrian Succession, they dubbed it. Of course, they also called it the Silesian Wars between Prussia and Austria. And it was all a bunch of countries didn't support her being the ruler. And so there's cases where some of the countries tried to come in and seize, control of her territories that she controlled. But after the war, they kind of, eventually solidified things, and she became kind of a settled ruler. I think it helped that she was married to Francis of Lorraine, who became Holy Roman Emperor in 1745, and that kind of solved some of the differences there afterwards. Now, she had a bunch of children, of course. There's really two main, she had two sons that became emperor later. They had Joseph II, who's here. And then she had another son who's not listed, named Leopold II, who became also emperor. So she had two children that were emperor overall. Also, I don't know if I have it in there or not, about her daughter. I don't think she's in there anywhere, but I'll add it on here. But also, she had a daughter, Maria Theresa. Her real name was Maria Antonia was her name. She later became known as Marie Antoinette. You probably heard of her. That was Maria Theresa's daughter. And we'll have a slide on her much. I don't know why, because we'll talk about her later. But her real name was Maria Antonia. If you know about her, later she would go on and she would marry the what would later be she was married to later the King of France, which is King Louis the 16th, of course. And part of why she had her marry him was because it was like a diplomatic alliance that they formed with the French later, because Prussia had become their enemy. So they were looking for a new ally, in Europe. And so Marie Antoinette would later go to France and marry him, of course. It's really the Dauphin, I think they call it. He was later the crown prince that would become the king of France, Louis the 16th. And that was kind of a tragic situation later, if you know about it, because she ended up, both of them, Louis the 16th and Marie Antoinette, ended up, of course, getting killed during the French Revolution, which broke out in 1789. That's kind of a tragic story. She wasn't very popular in France later, Marie Antoinette, because she was this Austrian princess, and I think the French still saw the Austrians as their enemy up to that time. So that's a little later when that happens, kind of between those wars, the War of the Austrian Succession and the so-called 7 Years' War that, of course, comes later and all that. Let me talk about her main son became ruler. Joseph II, of course, became real famous ruler in Europe, and was really he was kind of a radical ruler. If you study about Joseph, he was a famous enlightened despot, like in the late 19th century. There's been several rulers that have been considered enlightened despots. These reformed, absolute rulers like him, and you got Frederick the Great in Prussia, Catherine the Great in Russia that you had. He might have been the most radical of all the different enlightened despots. His reforms were given a nickname, which I think it's spelled wrong, but it's usually Josephinism with an I. And that's what they called it, because it was kind of named after him. And he actually co-ruled with his mother from like 1765. When he was like Holy Roman Emperor, and he was Holy Roman Emperor for like 1765 to 1790, like 25 years. And he kind of was sole ruler for like 10 years, like by himself, reigning, because she died in 1780. So even though he was Holy Roman Emperor up to 1780, she had the real power. That's, I guess, him, with, his mom, Maria Theresa. He's known for a lot of things that's famous. He abolished serfdom, which is kind of, something that they're starting to do in Europe at the time. So that's the first thing that they did that's famous under him. Also, he had this thing he passed, which was called, I'll give you the nickname, but it's called I'll put it up here for you, but it was called the Patent of Toleration that came out. And the years were 1781 and 1782. There were two of them. The Patent of Toleration in 1781, and in the Patent of Toleration in 1782. The one in 81 gave religious and civic rights to Protestants, because if you know about the Habsburgs, they were pretty much a Catholic, dynasty and empire, and then the one in 1782 gave religious and civic rights to Jews, and so that's going to be important later, because that's going to lead eventually to like the emancipation of Jews in Europe and all that. You'll start seeing that in Europe between the 18th and the 19th century overall. Also, you can see here he had like a freedom of the press, which is true. He reformed the judicial system. He abolished torture and the death penalty, which is the time that's pretty amazing, for the 18th century. He expanded state schools. One thing he did that was kind of controversial at the time, which is true. He made German the official language of his empire, German. I know it sounds like they're mostly German down there, but if you study about the Habsburg Empire that around Austria, they had different peoples that spoke different languages, and one group that didn't like it was the Hungarians. They hated it because they spoke Hungarian. They weren't too happy about that one. And then, of course, you see he established hospitals, insane asylums, poorhouses, orphanages. So he's really trying to do stuff to help out the people and all that. He was also a big patron of the arts, music. He was a big supporter of classical musicians. Like, you've heard of Mozart, right? Beethoven. He was obsessed with Mozart. He loved Mozart, and all that. He was like a kind of a court musician under Joseph and all that. So he was a very famous, pretty much ruler. And most of these changes he made were predominantly within like a 10-year period. And so they got his reforms were called Josephinism and all that. Some of them were reversed later, but a lot of them were kept pretty much afterwards, going into the 1800s, which would help to modernize pretty much the Austrian Empire and its states. Then, of course, what happened was you have a few more rulers that came later. They have Leopold II. He was a brother of Joseph II. Joseph didn't have any kids, and he only reigned like around 2 years. Leopold II. And Leopold II was an enlightened despot, kind of sort of too, as well. And then Leopold II had a son named Francis, later called Francis II. He was basically a nephew of Joseph II. He would come in, and what he's famous for a bunch of things. Francis II. Francis II was the last Holy Roman Emperor. And what happened was he kind of came into power around the same time when the French Revolution broke out. And then what occurred was Napoleon Bonaparte seized control of France. And then, as you know, he basically conquered most of Europe. So he was around at the same time, both those two guys. And what eventually occurred was that because of Napoleon's conquests, in like Germany and all that, it led to the dissolving of the Holy Roman Empire. So the empire was gotten rid of by Napoleon in 1806. So what happened was he wasn't Holy Roman Emperor anymore, which was his title, Francis II, Holy Roman Emperor. Well, they got rid of that. And what happened with Austria was Austria then became known as the Austrian Empire. And so he became known as the Emperor of Austria, as Francis I. Just confusing. It really is confusing, because he goes from being Francis II, Holy Roman Emperor, to being Francis I of Austria. Yeah, because all the rulers after that, up to 1918 and World War I, are known as the Emperor of Austria, basically, is what their main title is, along with a bunch of other titles like King of Hungary, etc., that they had as well. The empire went through different names later, like Austro-Hungarian Empire or Austria-Hungary. That was the common names that they called the Habsburg Empire of the Austrians, Habsburgs. So that's the other names that they call it. But like I said, I told you before, there was no official name for it, what they called this empire of the Austrian Habsburgs. And their greatest ruler was later this ruler named Franz Joseph I, who reigned from 1848 to 1916. He reigned like 68 years, which Franz Joseph I is the ruler when World War I would break out with Austria-Hungary. And I think he's like in the top 5 longest reigning rulers of Europe. We won't talk much about Franz Joseph I right now. We'll probably wait on that when we get more into World War I. So let me go ahead and review a little bit, and then we'll, of course, move on to talk about the Prussians. We haven't really kind of reviewed this section at this time. It says, what 2 major European powers emerged in Central Europe, especially after the 30 Years' War? Yeah, you have the Austrian and Prussian states that would kind of start breaking away from the Holy Roman Empire. They would become eventually separate states over time. And they had different dynasties. Austria had the Habsburg dynasty, which is either spelled with a B or a P, H-A-B or H-A-P, Habsburg. And then the other dynasty was the Hohenzollern dynasty, which we'll get more into later about that one. That one's kind of hard to say and pronounce, but it's Hohenzollern right there. And what empire did they both rise out? I just said that, but that was the Holy Roman Empire, and it's pretty much those two states kind of began to kind of emerge after the 30 Years' War. And part of their territories, like both of them, some of them are in within the Holy Roman Empire, and some of their territories are not. Like I think with Austria, Hungary's not, and then I think with the Prussians, East Prussia was not. So, who were some Spanish Habsburg rulers? The two that were the most famous, of course, were Emperor Charles V, who was also called King Charles I or Carlos I in Spain. And Charles V was the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain. He was really powerful. If you study about him, remember he was the most powerful ruler in the 16th century, and he controlled like half the world. It seemed like it, as I told you how they had like 1.5 million square miles that was controlled under him. He was the one that the Reformation started under. He's the one that issued the Edict of Worms against Martin Luther. He was involved in the Peace of Augsburg, etc. He then split the empire in half. He gave one half to his brother Ferdinand, and then the other half went to his son King Philip II. And King Philip II, ended up being the king of Spain and controlled the New World. I wouldn't worry about him right now, King Philip II, because I think that's going to be more or less on our next exam later when we get to talking about history of like England and all that. So don't worry about Philip II. What was the Habsburg Empire? Well, there are two of them. There are several Habsburg states, but there's two main empires. They had the Spanish Empire, which was often called Habsburg Spain. Now it went from like around 1510s to 1700. Ends with King Charles II, who didn't have any kids, and the Bourbons later got it, Spain. And then the other was the Austrian Habsburg Empire, which has got all kinds of names. Habsburg Monarchy, Habsburg Empire, Austrian Empire, Austro-Hungary, and then Austro-Hungarian Empire. Yeah, I know. It's confusing. But it's basically, it's got many names. But this is the one of like the Austrians that controlled it from the 1500s up to like World War I. Who was the greatest and most powerful Austrian Habsburg ruler 17th century? That was Emperor Leopold the First. He was considered one of the longest reigning Habsburg rulers, especially the Austrian branch. And he was a rival ruler to Louis XIV in France. What palace did they're talking about Leopold. What palace did he build? His heirs built in their central capital of Vienna. That was the Schönbrunn Palace, which became later the Summer Palace, of course, in Vienna, Austria. Of course, went through a bunch of stages, but it's basically a type of Rococo type palace complex that was built in Vienna. It was built over many years because they changed the facade and the interior a lot. What wars did Leopold fight against? Well, I didn't really go over the Bourbons as much, but with the Ottoman Empire, the big one was called the Great Turkish War, or also called the Austrian-Ottoman War. That was a war which took place between 1683 to 1699. It was a pivotal war because it led to the expansion of Austria and their empire. And through that war, Austria was able to seize control of pretty much a majority of Hungary. They also took over Transylvania and also an area called Slavania. And then, of course, they say the war was one of the main wars that caused the decline of the Ottoman Empire. So the Turks start declining from there up to 1800s and all that. Which Habsburg was the last male descendant of the Austrian Habsburg line? That was, of course, Emperor Charles VI. He didn't have any children. any male children that could take the throne. So he was forced to give it to one of his daughters, which was controversial at the time. So he issued what became known as the Pragmatic Sanction, which was in 1713. What that did was it gave basically control of the Habsburg territories to a female heir. Who was that female heir? That was his daughter, Maria Theresa, and she became the only ruler of the Habsburg Empire. She, of course, was known as the Archduchess of Austria, the Queen of Bohemia, the Queen of Hungary, and she was later Empress, Holy Roman Empress as well, because she married what became eventually the Francis of Lorraine, or Francis I, who was the Holy Roman Emperor. So it was really a name and just title, because she wasn't really the Holy Roman Emperor, but she had the real power because she controlled a lot of the land. What dynasty emerged after Maria Theresa married Francis I, or Francis of Lorraine, Holy Roman Emperor, which would really start about 1780, I guess, officially. That would be called the House of Habsburg-Lorraine, with a dash in it, basically. This dynasty will be around until World War I. It only had 6 rulers. That was part of it. Who were some rulers that were part of that? Of course, the most famous was Emperor Joseph II. He was really the first ruler of the Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty that you've got. He would rule as Holy Roman Emperor, also ruled over the Habsburg lands by himself for about 10 years after his mother died in 1780. Her, like Maria Theresa and her son Joseph, were both considered enlightened despots. What were enlightened despots? They were basically these absolutist rulers that believed in reforming their state. They wanted to make changes not just to the government, but to make reforms that would help the people, not just the upper classes, but they are the lower classes as well. So it's kind of like reforms from above, coming down, basically, which is what Joseph did. Joseph's reforms, like I said, you saw there was a bunch of radical things that they did to the country, which you saw in that slide there, which was like a whole bunch of them, right? From getting rid of serfdom, religious, civic rights for Protestants, Jews, freedom of the press, reformed the court systems, got rid of death penalty, abolished torture, expanded schools, hospitals, insane asylums, poorhouses, orphanages. Even, like I told you, he even was controversial with basically making everybody speak German, which they didn't like too much. So, yeah, he was known for all kinds of reforms. The nobility called it Josephinism, is what they dubbed it. Of course, her famous daughter, Maria Theresa's daughter, later became the Queen of France. I told you it was Marie Antonia, of course, but they called her later Marie Antoinette. And so she's well known. His nephew later went on to the nephew of Joseph II, later was, of course, the last Holy Roman Emperor. That was, of course, Emperor Francis II. They called him. He was Holy Roman Emperor in 1806, but because of Napoleon taking over Europe, Napoleon basically had the Holy Roman Empire dissolved, and so he was its last ruler. And then he went on to be basically the first ruler of what I guess they called later the Austrian Empire. So I guess one of the nicknames they start calling their state, because he then takes up that new title, which is Emperor of Austria, as Francis the First. So now I did add in a question here too. Yeah, who was the longest reigning ruler? That's of course of the that would be the Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty. That would be, of course, I told you, Emperor Franz Joseph, or Franz Joseph I, who was one of the last major rulers. They had one more after that, actually. It reigned till 1918, which was Emperor Charles I. Yeah, but they had 6 rulers. I skipped one, I think, in there somewhere, but that's okay about that. So that's enough about talking about that. And of course, I'm going to move on. I'm going to, of course, next talk about Prussia. about their history and all that. If anybody has any questions about something, let me know during the lecture so I can, answer that later. If anybody is still, looks like some people, anybody who wants to come into StreamYard, looks like we have a few people watching right now. You can, I got room in here if anybody wants to come in. So let's talk about the Prussian state. Of course, that would emerge later. Of course, Prussia was called different names. Of course, they were originally known as actually called Brandenburg, Prussia. That was the original name that they called the state. Of course, and they were ruled by a dynasty I've talked about before, which is the Hohenzollerns. Probably wonder where the name came from and all of that. It's a name that kind of goes back to kind of like early modern times, and they believe it's a name that was named after a castle. That's called Hohenzollern Castle in Germany. Hence the name. Prussia was a state that was made up of actually two states. It wasn't one. Or actually it was a collection of states, really, that would merge together. But there were two main states that would merge together. One called Brandenburg and another one called Prussia. So these two states they had different names, I know. Like the one in Prussia was really here, like above Poland, Lithuania. It's really originally called East Prussia. That's what they called it. And then the Brandenburg state was over here. They had different cities that were capitals. Like the one of Brandenburg had Berlin. And then the one that was the capital of what is East Prussia or Prussia over here was a city called Königsberg. Which I don't know if you know about Königsberg, but Königsberg is now the capital of Kaliningrad. It's a little bitty state that's kind of pro-Russian. That's around the same area right here. It's not controlled by Germany anymore. That's because of what happened in World War II later. They actually, I think these are the official names. I guess the states were called the Electorate of Brandenburg. I guess that's what they usually called it. And then the Duchy of Prussia. So the rulers of these states, like the ruler of Brandenburg was called the Elector of Brandenburg, and the ruler of Prussia was called the Duke of Prussia. And when the two states combined later, the ruler had both titles. He was called the Elector of Brandenburg and the Duke of Prussia. And so Brandenburg, Prussia. But later what happened, if you know about it, as it became a more viable combined state and kingdom and all that, they later dropped the word Brandenburg and it just became known as just Prussia or Kingdom of Prussia up to like 1918 that they have later. So that's kind of the area. So you can see part of like the state, emerged in the upper part of northern Germany within the Holy Roman Empire. And then it did have some territory that was outside of it. East Prussia, Pomerania, just kind of up in here. All this is like now part of Poland now, which was because of World War II later. But all this will be combined into one state here, which will go eventually all the way to the Rhine River at one point. It will even go down to Bavaria, the German state will push down there in this area here. I'm actually related to some people that are Prussians, by the way. I'm kind of part Prussian myself, on my father's side that migrated to America in the 1800s. I think my ancestors came from the Rhineland. Yeah, is where they came from originally. So anyway, yeah, I'm kind of descended from Prussians, Germans, Now, kind of get into some of the rulers they had. Now, one of the first great rulers of Prussia was a man named Frederick William, or Wilhelm, and he was nicknamed the Great Elector, they called him. He's a very important figure, Frederick William. He lived in the 17th century, mid to late 17th century. And Frederick William, he's part of why there's such a popular name. Frederick and Wilhelm are real popular in Germany later. And he's the father of Prussia, as they called him. So he's one that kind of helped create the future Prussian state, which was not a kingdom yet. He was known for developing their military, which is something that the Prussians are very, very famous for, is their military traditions. Later Prussian soldiers are very sought after as mercenaries throughout Europe. Some even came to America and fought during like the American Revolution, etc. And he got a lot of the Junkers, they're called, which is that so-called young nobles, to join his state. And a lot of them were in the military, like the officers in the military. And through tax breaks, he was able to eventually consolidate his power over time. And so Frederick William was kind of considered to be one of the first, maybe absolute rulers that the Germans had. He was Elector of Brandenburg, and he was also called, of course, the Duke of Prussia. So he had two titles. So he ruled over both areas. And he was called Great Elector because he was this great political type military ruler. And so a lot of the Prussian rulers are kind of like these militaristic type, leaders that are pretty powerful. And over time, by the time you get to the early 1700s, the Prussian rulers become pretty much absolute. Of course, they have these two other rulers that come in afterwards, which are, of course, the first two kings of Prussia, which later will be King Frederick I and also King Frederick William I, who reigned pretty much in the early 1700s. You can see there overall. Let me get to, of course, the first one, which is right here. You have, of course, King Frederick I of Prussia, who reigned from 1701 to 1713. Hey, Alexandra. Anyway, of course, Gillies asked me a question about, he took control of, I think they signed a few treaties between them, but basically took control of Germany. He forced them to dissolve it. And then, of course, he because he wasn't Holy Roman Emperor anymore as Francis the Second, he became Francis I of Austria because there was no one before that. There was no Emperor of Austria before that with that title. So he became Francis I is what it is. But we'll talk more about what happens with Napoleon. That's something I wouldn't worry about right now about that. But anyway, talking about Frederick I, he was originally Frederick III of Brandenburg. He was also, of course, the Duke of what is Prussia as well. He was known for forming alliances with different powers in Europe at the time. And one of the big things that happened with him was he signed this treaty with the Holy Roman Empire. It's sometimes called the Crown Treaty of 1700. And there was a war that broke out in Europe that's called the War of the Spanish Succession, which would start they knew it was going to start 1701, and it would last till 1713. And there was a conflict in Spain at the time where the Habsburg ruler, King Charles II, didn't have any children to give the throne to. It was a real big issue in Europe. It happened at the beginning of the 18th century. And so the agreement was he would give it to one of his relatives who was a Bourbon, who happened to be the grandson of Louis XIV. And that was, of course, his name was Philip V of Anjou. He would come over and take over Spain, and Spain went Bourbon. This is a big problem, big bloody war. And so the Holy Roman Empire got mad about this. They wanted the throne back. And so they formed these alliances with all these states in Europe. And Prussia was one of them that allied with, of course, the Holy Roman Empire and Austria. And in return, they gave Prussia a recognition as a kingdom. So basically, with that, what happened was, I think it was in January of 1701, Frederick III became Frederick I, first king of Prussia, that name. And so Prussia became a kingdom which would last from 1701 to 1918. So a little over 200-something years that they'll be, of course. And this was all because of, Louis XIV, in Europe at the time. He's like the enemy of all these other European states. And Prussia's basically on the side against Louis XIV. But he didn't rule much. He wasn't really known for too much. Frederick the first Prussian king. Actually, his title wasn't really King of Prussia. That's the weird thing about it. It was King in Prussia, because the Prussian state was made up of two parts. One in East Prussia, which wasn't in the Holy Roman Empire, and the other part that was in Brandenburg, which was in the Holy Roman Empire. And so it's like the king was saying that, yeah, you got a kingdom, but it's just in East Prussia. That's the only thing. Now, Frederick William I, he was the other second Prussian king that would come in next that you had. So, yeah, remember the two ones we talked about first. So you got Frederick I, first king in Prussia, first Prussian king you got here. And then you got the second one, Frederick William I. And he had a nickname. He was called the Soldier King. And the reason why he was called that was because he was very militaristic. He was the most absolute monarch that the Prussians had. Pretty much it was like a military cult under him, the way it was. It was like a military society that the Prussians start having. And we study about his reign and after, the Prussians start pretty much having this military culture, which where I think on average between the 18th and 19th century, 3.6% of the population was in the military. Which is a lot of people, 3.6%. Kind of talk a few things about the Prussians. Like I said, the Prussians were known for their military traditions, military state. There was an old quote they'll mention about, which is very, very famous about Prussia. They used to say about Prussia back in the 18th and 19th century that Prussia is not a state that possesses an army, but an army that possesses a state. Frederick was known for developing something that's very famous in Germany later, which is called the Canton system. Let me put that back up on the screen so something happened here. I don't know what happened to the. Hold on here. But it was called the Canton system. And what was the Canton system? It was something that he came up with, and it was used by multiple rulers in Germany. And it was a deal where what they did was they divided Germany up into like various recruitment districts. Every district had to basically recruit soldiers throughout the Prussian state. And so that's what they call it, the cantons. Each district was called a canton, where the name came from. And it was around from 1733, I think is when they started it. And it was around till up to the Napoleonic Wars. I think they disbanded in 1813, but that's how they recruited all their soldiers and all that. My father says that that's part of why some of my people left, was because they forced a lot of people into conscription. Some people didn't want to be conscripted and all that. And so he thinks that's why we left, some of our relatives, because they didn't want to get drafted, and all that. And so that's something that he was known for. And I think Frederick the Great used the system too to draft soldiers, and a lot of the guys that were in the officers were mostly like the upper classes, which were called Junkers, with a J, spelled with a J. But his military expanded. Like, he doubled the military. I think by the time of his death in 1740, they had like 80,000 troops, which is quite a lot. He was a very staunch military guy, like I said, because that's why he got the nickname. But he didn't really fighting too many wars. Oh, he was also obsessed. I don't even hear the story about this. Kind of bizarre story, but he was obsessed with this. He wanted to have like an imperial guard. A lot of these kings and emperors had imperial guard, which, Napoleon was known for having his imperial guard that he had. But he had an imperial guard that was called the Potsdam Giants. That's what they usually dubbed it. Or I think the Germans call it the Longfellows. they kind of nicknamed it. And it was this imperial guard of like really tall men. The average height requirement, like minimum, you had to be 6'2". It's about my height, 6'2". So that was the smallest you could be. And then he would try to find people all over not just Germany, but all over Europe. He had one guy like 7'1". One guy 7'1". Some Irish soldier he found that was like really, really tall, but it wasn't like a real unit he fought with, because they were just too tall, these guys. But he would use them as like an imperial guard to protect him, or if he was like sick in bed or something, you'd have him march through his room to cheer him up. And they had a mascot that was a bear or something like. It was kind of weird, but it was like the first of these imperial guards that a lot of other kings and emperors start using later. And Napoleon had the same thing too. He had his famous imperial guard as well. That was well known. That was kind of a weird story about that, though, about him. We'll get to it, of course, in a second. But of course, he was famous for his son. His son is, real big, which is Frederick the Great. You see here, Frederick II. But he treated him badly. In fact, he beat the kid and really, really harsh toward him. He was really harsh towards Frederick the Great because Frederick, if you know about it, in his younger days, didn't really want to be king. He was really into the arts and culture. He played the flute. He was big into the Age of Enlightenment and studying about that, and didn't really want to be a soldier or a king like his father. And I think he beat that out of him eventually. But after his father would die, he would become an even greater ruler than he was overall. So anyways, kind of talking about some of the things about Frederick William I, but he was the second Prussian king. So then we've got, of course, the guy that really is the greatest ruler that they have, really, of the Prussian state. He was really the greatest king that the Prussians ever had overall, of course, which is, of course, Frederick the Great as a whole. Of course, known as Frederick II. You can see he's one of the longest reigning rulers in Prussian history. It looks like, 46 years. It's about how long he reigned. Frederick, of course, was big into the Enlightenment. He would use a lot of that to reform his state. That's one thing that Frederick was known for. He was an enlightened despot who believed in reforms from above, not only trying to change his state, but to better things for the population as whole. And he preferred to, by the way, call himself either the servant of the state, or I think the title he sometimes would call himself would be the first servant of the state, is what he dubbed himself. Didn't start out that way, though. I told you how under his father, he had a very harsh childhood. I think it was a case where his father even tried to have him court-martialed, his own son, which is crazy. And it had to do with this incident that happened under him, which happened in I think it was 1730, I think was the year. The so-called Cat Affair. I don't know if you heard about that, the Cat Affair that happened when his father was in power. He had this friend who was in the military. They were both in the military together, both officers, but his name was Hans von Katt. And I don't know if you know much about Frederick the Great. They believe he was gay. He liked men. And they think the two are lovers. At least that's the theory about it. And they decided they were going to run off together. I think they were going to run off and flee to England or something like that. And his father caught him before they could leave or whatever, and he arrested him, actually imprisoned his own son, Frederick William I, imprisoned Frederick, and I think he threatened to have him killed. He was going to execute his own son, but I think some people talked him out of that. But what he did instead was he took his friend von Katt and had his head cut off. He had him decapitated, and he made him watch his friend get executed. So, but like I said, he was a big influence. He was heavily influenced by the Age of Enlightenment, Frederick the Great, and he corresponded with different enlightened thinkers at the time. I don't know if you ever heard the story about this, but Frederick was very close friends with Voltaire, who was a French writer in the 18th century, and he even invited Voltaire to come stay and live at one of his palaces. Well, I think they quarreled a lot, I think back and forth, but they wrote to each other for years, back and forth. Now, I didn't really have all this in here, but yeah, he was known for reforms of the state. Over here, you can kind of see he did reform the educational and judicial system. Like he created a set of legal codes that kind of were named after him that were famous. He reformed the educational system. Like he offered education to everybody, starting from, about the Germans introduced kindergarten, the kindergarten grade that he started from there on up. I guess he's one kind of started that, like the age of 5 or whatever. But they offered education for just the lower classes, not just for the upper classes, basically. And they started dividing like schools into like schools for like skilled labor versus schools that would be college prep type schools where you go to college later. Yeah, religious tolerance towards different religions, like not just Protestants, which was the main religion in Prussia, but Catholics, Jews, could practice their religion. Got rid of torture. They start to end serfdom. I think it's kind of starting to end pretty much at that time. So now the other great thing that he's known for, Frederick, he was a military genius. They kind of consider Frederick the Great to be this kind of like Napoleon later. He's like a prototype to Napoleon Bonaparte. In fact, Napoleon once said that if it wasn't for Frederick, I wouldn't be here, militarily, especially when he conquered Prussia later. And one thing that Frederick did was he led troops in battle personally. His greatest victory was in the 7 Years' War, which was the Battle of Leuthen, you may have heard about. And he was famous for a military tactic that's called the oblique order. And the oblique order is a type of military maneuver where you would, it's like a flank attack, where an army would mass forces on an enemy flank, either left or right, and then attack quickly with a lot of force. And the idea was to roll up the enemy's flank and destroy their army from the left or the right. You see this a lot being used later in military warfare. He didn't invent it. It was invented by the Greeks a long time ago. But he evidently had studied Greek history and read about it and began using it in battles. And so, his battle that was called, I think I'll give it to you, it was the Battle of Leuthen, if you want to study about it later, which I think was in 1757, I think. That was considered his greatest battle. He had other battles where he fought like that too, but it was one of the most famous where he used the oblique order or oblique tactic in battle, which was devastating. Back in that battle, he was outnumbered 2-1, and that was the great thing about flank attacks. You could literally defeat an enemy with half the force of the other enemy if you can move your force fast enough. Because basically the enemy doesn't have enough forces to stop it on that one flank unless they bring up more forces. But if you're real quick, you can do that. His greatest, it's really his greatest conflict, if you really read about it, is the so-called Silesian Wars he fought. I've got a map showing you here, but Silesia was a territory that was part of the Holy Roman Empire. It was part of, Maria Theresa's states that she controlled within her empire. And he saw it ripe for the picking because she came to power in 1740, the same year he did. And so he basically saw her as a weak ruler. And so in the winter, you saw that in that short little video clip I gave you, but in the winter of 1740, it was December 1740, he attacked Silesia here. And it sparked a bunch of wars. They were called the Silesian Wars. They were dubbed. I think it was called the First, Second Silesian Wars. That caused what they call the War of the Austrian Succession to break out. And that was considered his greatest conquest, really, during a lot of these wars that he fought, Frederick the Great. And he was able to take possession of this area here. And so Frederick, part of why he's such a great ruler, was he begins to kind of connect all the Prussian lands into like one big state. Because before that, Prussia was just a collection of states, but it's going to become one big state. And another thing he's going to do too, which is very famous, he's one of the first to adopt the title King of Prussia, which he does in 1772. So anyway, so that's something he did. Now, later he would get involved in this other war, which we'll talk about later, which is the 7 Years' War, because the fact that Frederick attacked Austria in her territories, Maria Theresa is going to look around for a new ally, which by 1756 will be the French. Like France and Russia will be allied with them too. And so you're going to have this alliance later that's going to start forming where Austria, France, and Russia are opposed to Frederick the Great in Prussia and the British Empire, which is forming at the same time. It's also because of Hanover, because Hanover was a German dynasty that took over England and Scotland with the British. And so you got this diplomatic revolution I'll get to later that's going to form all because of Frederick the Great, So he wasn't very well liked in Europe, by the way. But he made a lot of enemies, the French, the Russians, the Austrians. And I'll get to the 7 Years' War later, but his state gets invaded by multiple powers. He almost gets destroyed, but a miracle happens later, and they eventually emerge as the Kingdom of Prussia, which continues later. He was a man that built a lot of great palaces, and of course, in Germany and Prussia, and let me get that out the way. He had 2 palaces he constructed that were famous. One was called Sanssouci, and then the other was called the New Palace. You see there, this one was built first, Sanssouci. It's a type of Rococo style palace, of course. That's where his burial place will be. That he'll have. That was basically his main summer palace he constructed. Which a lot of these palaces are kind of copies of other palaces that are being built at the time. And then the other one was, of course, the so-called New Palace at Potsdam, which are both built in the same location around Potsdam, near Berlin. That was finished in 1769. That was, of course, a French Baroque style type palace that he also built as well. Frederick had different nicknames, by the way. I forgot about this. But besides being called the Great, they did call him Old Fritz later, which Fritz is the German nickname for Frederick. That's what all the Germans still call him today, Old Fritz. And that's his most famous painting, really. And I think at the end of World War II, Hitler became obsessed with Frederick the Great and kept in his bunker at the end of World War II. So he's been this great ruler that people have kind of looked up to later as a whole. They have other, Prussian rulers that come later. There's basically another 6 other rulers that will follow after Frederick would die. But he didn't have any children, and so the throne went to one of his nephews, Frederick William II. All right, let me go ahead and move on. Of course, a few minutes left. I can go ahead and review real quick, and that's it for today. But if you have any other questions during the lecture, let me know. Put that up on screen for me later if you want. I'll look it up later if you have any questions. But what German state and dynasty emerged in north of Habsburg Empire, the Austrians? That was, of course, Prussia, originally called Brandenburg Prussia. And it was the Hohenzollern dynasty. What was the Prussia's original name? It was called Brandenburg or Brandenburg Prussia, but they later dropped it. And of course, now is now called just Prussia later up to like World War I. Who was their main patriarch? That was Frederick William or Frederick Wilhelm. Usually Frederick William is fine. And he was the founder pretty much of the Prussian state. He was known as the Great Elector because he was this great military statesman. Both, really. His son was important, Frederick I, because he would become the first king in Prussia, like the first Prussian king that you had. He was originally called Frederick III, they called him, but of course the first king with that name of Frederick, so he took Frederick I. He wasn't known for much except ruling for about 12 years, 1701 to 1713. Who was King Frederick I's son? Why was he called the Soldier King? That was King Frederick William I. Okay. And the second king. He was a military-style king. He was an absolutist type ruler. And Frederick was known for expanding the state and the military. I told you he doubled the size of the Prussian armies to about 40,000, which I think, I'm sorry, no, 40 to 80,000 is what it went. He doubled it to, he doubled it. It was 40, I think, under Frederick William. And then under Frederick William I, it was like 80,000 by the time his son, Frederick the Great, came in, which, by the way, was like the fourth largest army in Europe at the time. So it's pretty big. He was the peak absolutist monarch of the Prussians. He definitely was. He was a stern ruler, Frederick William I. Potsdam Giants was just this imperial guard of Frederick William I. It was actually around for a while, I think up into the 1800s, but it was kind of disbanded later. But it was basically this tall order. It was a imperial guard of tall soldiers, where they recruited people from all over Europe to be part of it. It's kind of a weird. I think he said that was his weird, strange habit. He wasn't into women. He was into requiring tall soldiers. Kind of weird. Which Prussian was known as the Great? Frederick II, as they call Frederick the Great. He was an enlightened despot because he believed in reforming the state from above. He began to, modernize the government, the judicial system, the schools, like the educational system of Germany, got rid of serfdom. He was just like Joseph II. He was tolerant of other religions overall. He was also a military genius as well. I told you how he invented that military tactic, or it didn't really invent it, but he popularized it, which is the oblique order. So that's pretty much why he was considered one of the greatest Prussian rulers, because of the fact that he modernized and made Prussia into like a world power. Oblique order, I told you, was a flank attack where one army attacks another on the right or the left flank to just destroy it, roll up and destroy their army from the side instead of from the front, like a frontal attack, which most traditional armies would do back in the old days. I'll tell you about some of the reforms of Frederick already previously. Which war did Frederick succeed in the most? That was the War of the Austrian Succession, which they call it a lot in Germany. The Silesian Wars, especially the First and Second Silesian Wars, which took place between like 1740 to 48. And from there, he was able to seize Silesia. Silesia was important. I think in the video they said because of the taxation thing. But they find out later in Silesia, which was real big, Silesia had a lot of natural resources like coal, iron ore, etc. That's pretty important later to the German war machines that they'll have later. What countries were later Prussia's main enemies? Of course, Austria became the main enemy of Prussia. Remember, Austria's Maria Theresa hated Frederick the Great. I think she called him that evil man. And those two would be enemies for a long time, like up into the 1800s. Prussia was also enemies later with the French and the Russians too. So he wasn't too well liked, Frederick the Great, in Europe. And so he formed an alliance with the British, who had become ruled by the House of Hanover, which is German. And so both those two German sides kind of got together. I'll get more into later. We're not really going to talk about it now, but what conflict will break out between 1756 and 63, which becomes like a world war fought between those two alliances I told you. That'll be the 7 Years' War. I'll get to that later, especially when we get more into the French versus the British. And you got this diplomatic revolution that kind of changes in Europe in the 1750s, and Prussia and Britain's fighting against Austria, France, who are also backed up by the Russians and the Spanish. So that's pretty much what you get later in the mid 18th century, the different alliances that are basically changing. So that's it lecture-wise on that. Of course, I won't have time to do Russia, but on next week on Tuesday, I'll get into the age of absolutism, talking about the Russians. I'll get into like the medieval history of Russia up to like the modern period. I'll talk about the main dynasties of Russia that they had, which were the Rurik dynasty and the Romanov dynasty. So I'll get more into that and talk about Peter the Great and all of that. That's going to be pretty much it for today. I just want to remind you before we go, though, that remember, don't forget those 2 Canvas quizzes expire tonight. You've got the one on the video on Hernan Cortez. Remember that one we watched, Fall of the Aztecs. And then you've got also the other Canvas quiz on exploration. Also, don't forget, next Tuesday, if you haven't turned in your vocab yet, that first key terms vocab, that is due next week on September the 22nd, Tuesday. So, okay, so don't forget about that. And I did put up a new one, the second one you can start working on, which isn't due till October. And I will next week, of course, be giving you y'all's first, online exam, first exam, which I'll probably announce on Tuesday next week. But we still got to finish Russia overall, because the first exam is going to pretty much have multiple topics on it: the Reformation, Age of Exploration, Conquest of America, and then the Age of Absolutism, which I'm trying to wrap up this week and next week. So that's it for today. If you have any comments, questions later about this lecture, let me know on YouTube. If you have any administrative questions towards me about something else, just email me at my email address I have for you. So that is it for today. Hope y'all have the great rest of the day, okay? And I guess I have a good weekend coming up as well. So y'all take care, and I will see y'all next week. Okay? So y'all take care.